Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The following day, Mark found himself walking back into the same bistro, the sound of the rain still tapping lightly against the windows. He felt a mix of nerves and confusion. Could he really go through with this? He had slept little the night before, his mind racing with doubts. But the weight of his financial troubles, the burden of his father's debts, and the possibility of securing a stable future for his family kept him moving forward. When he stepped inside, Eleanor was already there, seated at their usual corner table. She looked up at him as he approached, her calm demeanor never wavering. She gestured for him to sit, her eyes never leaving his face as if she had been expecting him all along. As the days passed, Mark began to adapt to his new life, but the changes were not without their challenges. He was now living in a penthouse that was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The apartment was spacious, filled with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. It was everything he had once dreamed of having, but it felt empty. Eleanor had arranged everything: his bills, his new home, his finances. She had even set up a trust fund for his mother, ensuring she would never have to worry about money again. But something was missing. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. Eleanor was always there, her presence almost constant, but she was still a stranger to him. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to this point in her life. She had always been so composed, so controlled. Mark knew she was a woman of power, but he hadn't yet figured out what lay beneath the surface. It was during one of their evening dinners, held at her private residence, that Mark started to see another side of her. The meal was extravagant, of course, with fine wine and delicacies he couldn't pronounce. But what struck him the most was Eleanor's gaze, distant, almost lost. For a brief moment, she looked human. Vulnerable. She wasn't the powerful CEO in that moment. She was just a woman, sitting alone at the head of an opulent table, looking out over the city. Mark watched her in silence, wondering what she was thinking. He had always known her to be confident, sharp, and unyielding. But now, for the first time, he saw her as someone who had built walls around herself. He wondered if those walls were the reason she had made this strange arrangement. Why marry him if she didn't need love? Why go through with it all? He had signed the contract. He had agreed to be her companion for a business arrangement. But over time, he began to feel something he hadn't expected. His feelings toward Eleanor were changing. It was subtle at first, little things, like the way she took her coffee or the way her eyes softened when she was lost in thought. But soon, it became clear he was starting to care for her. It terrified him. He had entered this marriage to escape financial ruin, to give his family a better life, and now he was falling for a woman he barely knew. That night, after dinner, Eleanor stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. Mark joined her silently, unsure of what to say. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You're thinking about the contract, aren't you?" she asked, her voice quiet. Mark hesitated before answering. "I'm thinking about us," he said finally. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze searching, as if she were trying to read his thoughts. "This was never about us," she replied softly. "It was always about business. You were a solution to my problem, and I was a solution to yours." Mark nodded slowly, but something in him refused to accept that explanation. He had agreed to the contract, but he didn't want to just be a solution. He wanted more. What if we could change that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's eyes widened for a moment, and then her expression softened. She stepped away from the window, walking toward him. What do you mean? She asked. He took a deep breath. I know we started this as a business arrangement. But I'm starting to care for you, Eleanor. More than I ever expected. Eleanor stood there in silence for a long moment, her gaze never leaving his face. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, unsure of how to respond. I didn't think this would happen, Mark continued, his voice strained. But it's happening. Eleanor stepped back, taking a deep breath as if weighing his words. Mark, she said softly, this was never part of the plan. We agreed this was just a contract. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the same conflict he felt inside. But sometimes, life doesn't follow the plan, he said, taking a step closer to her. For a brief moment, they stood there, the silence between them heavy with unsaid words. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice slow and hesitant. Maybe it doesn't. Mark reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was gentle, but it sent a spark of electricity through him. He had crossed a line, but he didn't care. He was no longer just playing the role of her husband in a contract. He wanted something more. He wanted her. The tension between them was palpable, but instead of pulling away, Eleanor took a step closer. The walls she had built seemed to crumble just a little, and in that moment, Mark felt a surge of hope. Maybe this contract, this strange arrangement they had, wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was just the beginning. The days after that evening seemed to blur together for Mark. What started as a simple business arrangement was slowly becoming something more complicated. The line between what was real and what was fake had begun to fade. He had tried to keep his emotions in check, but the more time he spent with Eleanor, the harder it became to separate the contract from his growing feelings for her. Eleanor, too, seemed to be changing. She had always been in control, confident in every move she made, but Mark had begun to notice small cracks in her armor. The moments when she let her guard down, when she showed him glimpses of vulnerability, were becoming more frequent. She no longer treated him like just a companion in a business deal. She was starting to treat him as if he mattered. And that scared Mark. He had signed the contract, agreed to this marriage, and yet, the more he cared about her, the more complicated everything became. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a gala she was hosting. It was a formal affair with the city's elite business magnates, politicians, and high-profile socialites. Mark had never been to a place like this, and the luxury of it all was overwhelming. But what shocked him the most was how easily he fit in. He had always been just a student, a person who barely scraped by. Yet now, he was surrounded by people who had once seemed so far out of reach. As the night went on, Mark found himself at Eleanor's side. She introduced him to guests as her husband, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It felt natural, like they had been doing this for years. He realized, in that moment, how far they had come since the initial agreement. He wasn't just a businessman's tool anymore, was her equal, her partner in this world of wealth and power. They danced together later in the evening, and as they moved across the floor, Mark caught a glimpse of Eleanor's face. She was no longer the cold, calculating woman he had met at the bistro. She was warm, genuine, as though she was enjoying this moment with him. The music swirled around them, and for the first time, Mark felt like he truly belonged. But that feeling didn't last long. As the night wore on, Eleanor grew quiet. Her gaze shifted to the crowd, her expression becoming distant. Mark could see the walls go up again, and he knew something was wrong. He followed her outside onto the balcony, away from the noise and the crowd. The cool night air hit him as he stepped into the open. Eleanor was leaning against the railing, looking out over the city. He could feel the tension in the air. "Eleanor," he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. She didn't turn to him immediately, but after a long moment, she spoke. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said, her voice low. This marriage. It was never supposed to be like this. I thought I could keep everything separate. I thought I could keep myself separate. Mark took a step closer, but he didn't touch her. He knew that if he did, it might break something. You don't have to keep it separate, he said quietly. We can figure this out. Together. Eleanor finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to be weighing his words. But what if this was never the plan? What if I made a mistake, Mark? She looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. I never thought I would let someone in, not like this. Not you. Mark felt a pang in his chest. It was as if everything they had built, every moment they had shared, was suddenly being questioned. But he wouldn't back down. You didn't make a mistake, he said firmly. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And I won't let you down. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes softening for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a flicker of something hope, maybe, or relief in her expression. She took a deep breath. I don't know what's going to happen next, Mark, she admitted. But I want to see where this goes. I want to see if this is real. Mark reached out and gently took her hand. It's real, he said, his voice steady. And I'm not going anywhere. The moment lingered between them, filled with quiet promise. Neither of them had the answers yet, but for the first time, they were both willing to find them together. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind for Mark. What had started as a simple business arrangement, a way to escape the financial nightmare his family had been trapped in, was slowly transforming into something more complicated, more real. Eleanor was no longer just the powerful CEO who had once seemed so distant and untouchable. She had become someone Mark was starting to care about deeply. The moments they spent together, whether at home or attending high-profile events, were no longer just a means to fulfill a contract. They were beginning to feel like the beginnings of something more genuine. Eleanor, too, seemed to be changing. At first, she had kept her emotions locked behind a wall of professionalism. But now, when they were alone, she had started to open up. She would smile at him more often, laugh at his jokes, and even share bits of her personal life stories of her childhood, the people who had helped her rise to the top, the struggles she had faced along the way. Mark found himself wanting to know more, to be there for her in a way that went beyond the contract they had signed. He had begun to realize that he was no longer living just for his family's future, but for something more. He was living for her, too. It was late one night when things began to shift again. Eleanor had invited him to join her at a small dinner gathering she was hosting for a few close friends and business associates. The night was intimate, filled with soft conversations and laughter. Mark noticed how comfortable he was in this setting, surrounded by people who once intimidated him. He had become accustomed to this world of luxury, wealth, and influence. But as he glanced at Eleanor across the room, his heart skipped a beat. She was laughing with one of her colleagues, her face lit up with joy, her eyes sparkling with warmth. For a moment, Mark couldn't help but wonder how much of that happiness was real. How much of it was just an act? He couldn't shake the feeling that, even though they had grown closer, Eleanor was still keeping something hidden. That night, as the party wound down, Mark found himself alone with Eleanor on the balcony of the penthouse. The city lights stretched out before them, and the soft hum of the evening was the only sound. They stood there in silence for a few moments, both lost in their thoughts. Finally, Eleanor broke the quiet. Mark, she said softly, I've been thinking. Mark turned to her, his expression serious. About what? She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice a little strained. About us. About this marriage. And what it really means. Mark stepped closer, his heart beating faster. What do you mean? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm. I've been so focused on the contract, on the business side of things, she said, her gaze drifting to the city below. But what if there's more to it than that? What if we're both pretending to be something we're not? Mark felt a pang in his chest. He knew exactly what she meant. He had been pretending, too. Pretending that this was just a business deal, that there was no emotional attachment. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had already started to feel more for her than he ever thought possible. He took a step closer to her, his voice softer now. "I don't think we're pretending," he said quietly. "I think we're both just scared." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "Scared?" she repeated. "Of what?" "Of the unknown," Mark replied. "Of what this could turn into. And of losing control. We're both used to being in control of everything of our lives, our work, our futures. But this is different. It's messy. It's not something we can plan." Eleanor remained silent for a moment, processing his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I don't want to lose control," she admitted softly. "But I also don't want to be alone anymore. I've spent so many years building my empire, protecting myself, that I forgot what it's like to let someone in." Mark reached out and gently took her hand. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Not anymore." For a long moment, they stood there, hands intertwined, both of them facing the unknown future together. Eleanor's walls were slowly crumbling, and for the first time, Mark saw her not as the powerful CEO, but as a woman who was willing to take a chance on love, on something real. As they stood on the balcony, the city lights below them shining brightly, Mark realized that he wasn't just part of a contract anymore. He was part of her life, in a way that was far beyond anything he had ever imagined. And in that moment, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it with Eleanor by his side. Weeks went by, and the bond between Mark and Eleanor continued to grow, though neither of them was ready to admit just how deep their feelings had become. They had navigated this arrangement, this strange, business-like marriage, without truly acknowledging the emotional territory they had crossed. But as time passed, the lines between what was real and what was contract began to blur. Eleanor had always been so composed, so controlled, but Mark saw her in ways no one else did. He saw the quiet moments, the fleeting expressions of vulnerability, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about the past. It was clear to him that she was a woman of contradictions, strong yet fragile, closed off yet yearning for connection. He was beginning to realize that she wasn't just a businesswoman who needed a companion for convenience. She was a woman who had built walls to protect herself, and Mark, somehow, had started to break them down. On a rainy evening, they found themselves together in their penthouse. The city lights outside flickered through the window, casting a soft glow on the sleek, modern interior. It was a quiet night, one that felt different than all the others they had spent together. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a weight in the silence that neither of them seemed able to ignore. Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the rain. Mark joined her, standing just a few feet away, unsure of what to say. "Mark," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his heart racing. "Yeah." She hesitated before continuing, her gaze still fixed on the rain outside. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through. About us." Her voice faltered for a moment, as if she was unsure whether to continue. "I know this isn't what we planned. We both signed that contract, but," she trailed off, her words hanging in the air. Mark stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "But what?" he asked gently. "What if we've been fooling ourselves? What if, deep down, we both knew this wasn't just about business?" Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious, but there was something else in her Aissa's softness, a hint of something she had been keeping hidden for too long. "What are we really doing here, Mark?" she asked. "Is this just a contract? Or is there something more? Something that neither of us expected?" Mark didn't know what to say at first. He had spent so much time pretending, telling himself that this arrangement didn't mean anything, that it was just a way to survive. But the truth was undeniable. He cared for her. He had come to care for her in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I think we both know the answer to that," he said quietly. Eleanor took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You're right," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I never thought I'd let anyone get this close. I never thought I could. But with you," she paused, searching for the right words. "You've made me feel things I didn't know I was capable of feeling." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The touch sent a spark of electricity through him, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, there was no more pretending. No more business deal. Just the two of them, standing in the quiet of their shared space, facing the truth they had both been avoiding. "Eleanor," Mark said, his voice low and steady, "we don't have to pretend anymore. I don't want to be just a contract. I want to be with you, for real." Eleanor's eyes softened as she looked at him. There was a long pause, a moment of uncertainty between them, before she finally spoke. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of letting go of everything I've worked for. Scared of losing control. But most of all," she trailed off, her gaze dropping to their joined hands. "I'm scared of loving you." Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He had always known that Eleanor was a woman of strength, of resolve, but hearing her admit her fears was something he hadn't expected. It made her feel more real to him than ever before. "You don't have to be scared," he said gently, lifting her chin so she would meet his eyes. "You don't have to lose control. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor looked into his eyes, her expression a mix of fear and hope. For a moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. The noise of the world outside, the expectations of others, it all disappeared. In that moment, it was just the two of them, standing together, facing the unknown. Slowly, Eleanor's lips parted in a soft smile. It was small, but it was enough. "Maybe," she whispered, "maybe we don't need to know everything right now. Maybe we just need to take it one step at a time." Mark nodded, his heart lifting. "One step at a time," he echoed, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The weeks following that evening were filled with a mix of uncertainty and hope. Mark and Eleanor, both hesitant to acknowledge it, had begun to truly see each other not as business partners bound by a contract, but as two people who had somehow found each other in the most unexpected of circumstances. The boundaries between what was real and what was not had begun to fade. Eleanor had become more open with him, allowing him into parts of her life she had kept hidden for years. And Mark, for the first time, wasn't afraid to admit that he had fallen for her, despite their unconventional beginning. It was on one quiet evening, after a long day of meetings, that the next turning point arrived. Eleanor had invited Mark to dinner at their penthouse, a casual night between the two of them with no guests, no business obligations. It was just them, something they hadn't done in a long time. They sat across from each other, the soft glow of the candlelight flickering between them. The conversation was light at first, talk of work, family, and the future. But as the evening went on, Mark noticed something in Eleanor's eyes. There was a restlessness there, an unease that hadn't been there before. After dinner, as they moved to the living room to unwind, Eleanor stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Mark joined her, standing beside her in silence for a moment before speaking. "Eleanor, what's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle. She didn't turn to him immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately," she said, her words slow, as though she was carefully choosing each one. "About how far we've come, how different everything is from what we planned." Mark stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. He could feel the tension in the air. "I know we made a decision to take this journey together," she went on, her eyes fixed on the view in front of them. "But now I'm wondering if I can really trust this. If I can trust you." The word stung, though Eleanor's tone wasn't accusatory. It was filled with uncertainty, a fear she had never shown before. Mark's heart clenched at the thought of losing her, of everything they had built together unraveling. He stepped closer to her, his voice firm. "Eleanor, you don't have to be afraid. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. This is real. I want this. I want you." Eleanor turned to face him then, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps an answer to the doubts she had been carrying for so long. "But what if I've been wrong about everything?" she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "What if I've made a mistake letting someone into my life, into my world?" Mark reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. He looked into her eyes, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You haven't made a mistake, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and sincere. "You're not alone in this. You don't have to do this on your own anymore." For a long moment, they stood there, looking at each other, the world outside forgotten. Then, slowly, Eleanor's expression softened. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath as if letting go of a weight she had been carrying for too long. When she opened her eyes again, there was something different in her gaze. "I'm scared, Mark," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared that this won't last. Scared that it's all too good to be true." Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He stepped closer, pulling her into his arms, holding her tight. "We don't know what the future holds," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. "But I know one thing, we'll face it together. No matter what." Eleanor held him close, the tension slowly leaving her body. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in something more than just the contract, more than just the safety of keeping everything controlled. She allowed herself to believe in them. Mark and Eleanor were no longer just two people in a business arrangement. They were partners in a life they had built together, and for the first time, both of them were willing to embrace the unknown, no matter where it led. Together, they would face whatever came next. Days turned into weeks, and Mark and Eleanor continued to grow closer. The tension between what they had signed and what they had come to feel for each other was undeniable, but neither of them was willing to face it head-on. They were both scared of the emotions they had started to feel, scared of what it meant for their future. But despite the fear, they could no longer deny the connection they had. One evening, after a long day of meetings and work, they found themselves sitting together on the couch in the penthouse, the soft glow of the city lights casting shadows on the walls. The air between them was charged, filled with the unspoken words they had been avoiding for so long. Eleanor sat with her legs tucked beneath her eyes staring out the window, lost in thought. Mark couldn't help but watch her, the way the light caught her features, how vulnerable she looked despite her usual composed exterior. He had always admired her strength, her ability to handle everything with ease, but tonight, he saw something different. She was tired. Tired of the walls she had built around herself, tired of holding everything in. He could feel it in the silence that hung between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Eleanor, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending that this is just a contract. Not anymore." Eleanor turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm saying that I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep living this life with you if we're not honest about what's really going on. About what I'm feeling. About what you're feeling." Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment, Mark saw the walls she had carefully built around her heart begin to crack. She looked away, her gaze lost in the distance. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "I don't know if I can give myself fully to someone again." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The touch was light, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. "You don't have to be afraid, Eleanor," he said softly. "I'm not asking for anything more than what we already have. But we can't keep pretending. We can't keep holding each other at arm's length." Eleanor looked at him then, her gaze searching, as if trying to figure out if he was telling the truth. "What if it all falls apart?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "What if we get too close and it doesn't work? What if I'm not ready to let go of control?" Mark squeezed her hand gently. "What if we fall even more in love? What if we find something real, something that's ours? We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just have to be honest with each other." Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Mark thought she might pull away, but instead, she leaned into him. Slowly, she let go of the tension she had been holding in, allowing herself to trust him, to believe in something more than the contract. "Maybe it's time to let go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling the weight of the moment. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. They didn't need to know what the future held, not yet. All that mattered was that they had each other. And that, in itself, was enough. The next few days were filled with quiet moments of clarity. Eleanor and Mark no longer avoided the truth. They faced it together, side by side, no longer bound by the terms of a contract, but by the promise they had made to each other to be open, to be vulnerable, to be real. It wasn't perfect. There were still fears, still doubts, but the connection they had was undeniable. They were building something new, something stronger, something that neither of them had ever expected. And as they stood together in the middle of their shared life, Mark knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. A chapter that was no longer defined by the past, but by the love they were now willing to give each other. The days following their quiet confession were filled with small, meaningful moments that marked the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Mark and Eleanor had finally stopped pretending. They had stopped pretending that this was just a business arrangement, stopped pretending that they didn't care about each other. And, for the first time, they allowed themselves to be vulnerable. As the weeks passed, they began to rebuild their relationship this time, not based on a contract or a deal, but on something deeper, something real. They started to spend more time together, without the looming shadow of obligation hanging over them. Even the small, simple moments like sharing a cup of coffee in the morning or taking long walks in the park felt more meaningful. It was as though they were discovering each other for the first time. For Eleanor, it was a revelation. She had spent years building walls around herself, focused only on work and the cold, hard reality of life. She had never allowed herself to trust someone the way she was starting to trust Mark. For Mark, this was a new world, one that he had never dreamed he would be a part of. But with Eleanor, he felt a sense of belonging, a sense that he was finally home. Their life together wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of uncertainty about the future. But as they continued to face these fears together, they realized that they were stronger for it. It wasn't about money or status, Anna Marie, it was about love, trust, and the bond they had built. One evening, Eleanor invited Mark to attend a gala with her, one that she had been planning for months. The event was important. It was a gathering of influential figures from around the world, but for Mark, it wasn't the glitz and glamour that mattered. It was the fact that he was by Eleanor's side, standing together as equals, not as business partners or strangers, but as two people who had built something real. As the night went on, Eleanor looked at Mark from across the room, her eyes filled with warmth. She had always been the one in control, the one who made all the decisions. But tonight, as she watched him, she realized that she was no longer alone in her journey. Mark had become her partner in every sense of the word. The evening ended with a soft breeze, the sound of laughter in the distance, and the quiet hum of a future that they both knew was full of possibilities. As they stood by the car, ready to head home, Mark turned to Eleanor and took her hand in his. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he asked softly. Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, we have," she said. "And I think this is just the beginning." They got into the car, and as they drove through the streets, the city lights shimmering in the distance, they both knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The contract they had signed had led them to this moment, but it was the love they had found that would keep them together. They had started as strangers, bound by an agreement. But now, they were partners, equals, and the love they shared was the strongest bond of all.